Thank you, Inge Jan, and thank you for inviting me. It certainly is a great honor to come here, and I looked at the list of previous speakers and felt very humble about it. And I always also really enjoy talking to young people. Mostly I talk to older people. And after all, I hope and believe that many of you are future business leaders and also probably future NHO members. So you are actually a very important audience for me as well. I've been asked to talk about leading through change, and I believe it's a very relevant subject because we are in the middle of times of great change, and I think leadership is going to be needed more than ever. Actually, what we see now is a time where many different factors are hitting us at the same time. We have an economic downturn here in Norway, stemming from, among other things, the plunge in the oil price. We have a demographic challenge. We are growing older. We've been knowing that for a long time, and that's not necessarily bad news for us either. But on top of that, we have an immigration and a refugee crisis that we were not prepared for. And then we have massive changes that will stem from trying to combat the climate change. We have achieved some very necessary and ambitious goals of reducing emissions. And we're supposed to reach a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. That's only 14 years away. It's actually a very short time. And it means we're going to have to change a lot in order to achieve that. And then finally, we also have the technological changes, the digitalization that in some fields have been going on for a long time. But what's happening now is that it's spreading to everything, and it's changing things faster and more exponentially. And it's definitely going to affect how we all live and how we all work, and it's probably going to affect the whole economic ecosystem that we are all a part of. So what this means is that there is huge need for change. And I am at least very convinced that business will need to be a crucial key to solving a lot of these challenges. And last year I was in India, and I had the fortune of meeting the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Kailash Satyarthi, the one who won the Peace Prize with Malala. And he works in the slums in India trying to combat child labor. And he gave a very moving speech about his work and all he saw and experienced and the hope he tried to ignite and everything. And then he ended this very emotional speech by saying that and this was not a business crowd, by the way, and he said, business solves a lot more of society's problems than we tend to think. And I found great motivation in that, and I think he's absolutely right. If we take the climate challenge, for example, it's business who will have to come up with the solutions that will help us produce stuff and consume stuff in a more sustainable way. If you take, for example, health, it is business that does a lot of the research and develops the products that will help us end epidemics, make people able to live longer with a better quality of life, etc., etc. The migration crisis is also a business issue, not necessarily their immediate needs, but if you're going to stabilize a situation to avoid that people have to become refugees, that has a lot to do with economic prosperity and stability. And also, I think an issue that we have here in Norway that we don't talk so much about is that we have actually a growing problem with youth unemployment. We haven't spoken so much about it in Norway. When we read about that, what's happening in Europe, we tend to think that's not our problem. But the truth is that today, 71,000 Norwegians below the age of 30 are completely outside of work or education. That's actually a whole generation, it's a whole annual generation of youth that's not really taking part in the productive society. And the truth is that our youth unemployment is probably somewhere above 15%. So we do have a big issue with that. And again, the only way you can get both the refugees coming here and this youth that has not been able to take part of our work life, the only way you can get them into activity, give them a meaningful way of supporting themselves and their families eventually, is through business giving them the opportunity to come in, to learn, to master, and to produce. So we have a huge responsibility, and I really believe that if we're able to contribute, we will be able to solve these things in a better way. And that's also why we have we cooperate with the unions in Norway, with the LO, and we say that all these challenges that I talked about, they're common challenges. It's not us against them, like we sometimes haggle over wage increases and things like that. This is much bigger than that. These are common challenges, and we have to solve them together. So, if business is an important problem solver, how do you lead business through change? That's what I'm supposed to try to tell you. And it's a difficult subject in many ways, because I don't think there's one single recipe, and I think we will all have to make up our own recipes to a certain extent, and it depends a lot on the type of tasks you have, the environment you work in, and it depends a lot on how you are and what your abilities are. But I'll try to share some experiences that I've had, and I try to also talk about some of the people I have seen who have succeeded and who have impressed me. And if I should try to say some key words, I think two basic things that are very important for successful leadership in change. One is to be open-minded, and the other one is to be courageous. And I think in order to be really open-minded and courageous, you have to have self-confidence. So confidence is sort of a third word that I'll come back to. And when we talk about change, I think we shouldn't really talk about just understanding change. I heard a professor from INSEAD say once that the great leaders, they don't just understand change, they actually foresee it. Because in today's really rapidly changing world, you have to understand what's going to happen before it happens. You have to see the opportunities before they're obvious to everyone. And I'll try to say 4 things about this. The first one is this about foreseeing change. And not just foresee it, but also understand the difference in what's a temporary change and what's a fundamental change. And I'll give you an example. You said that I worked for Scandinavia Online and Aftenposten. Those are companies owned by the Schibsted Group that I'm sure many of you know. They also own VG and other media. And I worked there from 1998 and for almost 12 years. And so this was in the beginning of the internet era, the beginning of the digitalization of media. And I worked at the internet portal Sol. It exists today. It's not very big now, but it was the biggest site back then, and sort of spearheaded a bit the internet development. But I had realized that you're young, way too young to remember that. But anyway. So what happened was that at the end of the 90s, there was this big boom. Everyone thought, oh wow, the internet is really great, and this is it, and all these shares were, got really high evaluations. And then there was a big bust in the year 2000. The whole thing collapsed very quickly, and the share price of SOL went from 190 kroner to 10 øre in, I think, it was 3 weeks or something. It was absolutely brutal, and all of us who worked with it were declared idiots. And anyone who had any belief in the digital media age were, declared imbeciles, basically. And you can just imagine the media and everything writing about this all the time. Anyway, the thing is, the fact that the evaluation was overrated and that it burst, that was a temporary thing. But what was a fundamental change was digitalization, because media never became the same again. And I had some very smart superiors at Schibsted at the time, and they understood that. And they realized that the only way they could survive was to see the opportunities in this and grab those positions before others did. And what happened after that burst was that everyone pulled out of digital media, because this was a flop. And just precisely at that time, when everything was criticized and everyone else pulled out, they launched Finn.no. And you know Finn.no. And today it's hugely valuable. And back then, it was not that easy. It was all this criticism, and then an ad at Finn cost maybe 1,500 kroners, and the same ad in Aftenposten cost 150,000 kroners. And trying to make the argument that it was a really good idea to go for the Finn and not for the ad in the paper was really, really difficult. Very hard to convince people of that. And of course, all the ad people in the newspaper had a lot to defend. And this is the trick. If you want to succeed in managing change, you have to understand the underlying opportunity and you have to accept it. And then you have to see that opportunity sort of from the future. You can't just rely on what has been and extrapolate that. You have to try to say that this is never going to be the same again. And then you have to act upon it. And you have to dare to disrupt yourself, which is a terribly difficult thing to do because it's always less profitable in the beginning and it's very unpopular with all the people who are working in the business that you are disrupting. It's really hard to do. And it's very obvious in hindsight that it was the right thing to do. A good example of someone who didn't do it was Kodak. They invented the digital camera. I'm sure you heard it 1,000 times. They had too much to defend because their current business was so profitable, so they didn't develop it, and they went bust. And the thing is, when maybe in 2003, 2004, when it became obvious to everyone that this digital thing wasn't maybe a flop after all, then it was too late because the position was already taken, and anyone who has tried to launch something to compete with Finn, they have not been able to succeed. So the thing is, when the change is obvious, it's too late. So you have to act upon it when it's not obvious, and that's when it's incredibly difficult, because you're going to be criticized a lot for trying to disrupt yourself and do what you do. All right. Number 2 is to understand what's the true value in an opportunity. And I'm going to use the same example again. It's a bit old, but you have to bear with me. I'm getting old, I guess. It's back from those days again. In Scandinavia Online, which then we launched an internet portal, and it was owned by Schibsted and Telenor. And most of the people working there came from VG and other newspapers. And of course, they were used to publishing content, right, on paper. And they were still publishing content, but this time on a screen. And that was the mindset they had naturally, right? And they were very content-oriented. The value was in having the content online. And then there was a young marketing manager. He came into I was completely new, I just started, and he came into the management meeting and he said, he came with a presentation and said that we were mistaken about the business model because the true value of this company was the search engine called Kvasir, and I don't even think it exists anymore. But this was in 1998. It was before Google was invented. And we actually had a really good search engine. And he said the value in the internet is going to be able to be the ones who control the navigation of the internet, because the content is going to be so huge that the ones who control the navigation of the content are the ones who hold the value. Not the content, but the navigation. And a lot of these old Schibsted people were really brutal to him, sent him out, didn't really listen very carefully. And I have thought about that meeting so many times, because he was of course right, and what he was able to do was not to look upon what we had been used to, but he was able to see ahead and then sort of try to roll the change back to what's valuable here today given what the future is going to look like. And that's also quite a difficult thing to do. So first you have to have the imagination to do that, and second of all you have to have the courage to stand up and say it. Even that was unpopular too. And I have reminded myself of that episode many, many, many times. And I think today, we also, take an example like Uber, which has been spoken a lot about lately. What do you think is the real, to whom is Uber the biggest threat? A lot of people say the taxi business, right? Who do you think it really is? Who do you think is going to be disrupted the most by Uber? Exactly, because people are not going to buy as many cars. 1 out of 4 Uber users in the US have either canceled or postponed a car purchase that they planned to do originally. Uber is going to make us need less cars. That's the big disruption. So it is this thing about trying to understand, who is really being disrupted and what's the real value and real consequence and effect of the change that's taking place. Number 3 is, I think, to manage change in a good way has a lot to do with perspective. And in business and in society as a whole, it's very important to have good collaboration. I'm sure you take courses in collaboration here at BI. It's very important to have good relations. And it's really important to understand, be it your customer or your opponent or your partner or whoever it is. I think in order to do that, you have to have the ability to put yourself into different perspectives from your own. And that's easy to stand here and say. It's sometimes really hard to do. And I can give you an example. I heard an anecdote recently that there had been a meeting between Angela Merkel and Putin. And Merkel had asked Putin, and I know this story is true because I actually heard it from, this is terrible name dropping, but I heard it from Jens Stoltenberg, so it's true. And he heard it from Merkel, so this is true gossip coming your way here. Anyway, Merkel had asked him, so, you know, you act like you're afraid we're going to invade Russia. She had asked him, and then he had said, no, I don't think you will ever invade Russia. But what happens when you're not there anymore? You see, once every century, there is a crazy man from the West who invades Russia. First it was Karl XII, then it was Napoleon, then it was Hitler, and now we are in a new century. Mind-blowing, right? We never think in that perspective. I don't know if he really does either. I mean, he might just have said that to put her off, but it is something with understanding some of the reasonings why people act the way they do. And I read another anecdote that caught me a bit, and that was while I worked in Scampix, actually, which is a picture agency. One of the photographers told me this, that when the Berlin Wall came down in '89, of course, you know, all the world media went to Berlin, and everyone wanted to take pictures, and they were all on the you know, by the wall where they were knocking down, and people, you know, climbed the wall, and I'm sure you've all seen the pictures, and everyone took those pictures. One single photographer, he went to the other side, and then he focused on taking pictures of the East German border guards just as they became unemployed. Very different picture. They were not happy. And that is also a very important perspective on what happened, and also a very important perspective of how that whole thing was dealt with going forward. But out of hundreds of photographers, only one person took those pictures, you know? And it's about, you know, being able to see the whole picture of a situation. It's really important to try to do that. And I work on myself all the time because we, you know, I head up the NHO, and we have the unions sort of as opponents. I say sort of because we also cooperate about a lot of things. And if you try to just sit and actually really understand the perspective, why does she argue the way that she does? What are her considerations that she has to, you know, that she cannot ignore? I mean, if you really work on yourself all the time to get that full picture, you are also able to find better solutions. And you're able to talk about it without yelling or anything like that. It's possible. Okay. Ambition is my fourth point. I saw a video today, this morning actually, in a different conference, of Steve Jobs. It's from 1995 when he was working with the Next computer before Apple. And he says the thing is, you know, you come into life, and many people believe life is there with sort of its borders and limitations, and it's all about trying to fit in, not bounce the borders too much, fit in there, live a good life, earn some money, have a family, and that's great. And he said, I believe you have to nudge those walls. You can't just fill your life within that frame. You have to change the frame. And he really did that. I mean, he has changed all of us, one way or the other. He's really made a huge impact. And I believe we cannot all be Steve Jobs, but I do believe there is a very big difference in attitude between filling a job or filling a life based on what's expected and actually trying to shape your life or shape your job beyond what's expected. And I think true leaders, they are shapers. They're not fillers. And I had an interesting talk once with one of our top politicians, not Stoltenberg this time, another one, and he was a previous minister. He was a minister of one of the ministries for 4 years. And when I took the job in NHO, he actually came to my house one day and we had a good talk, and he said that, he wanted to share his experience with me, because he said, when I became minister, I was so worried about making mistakes, and I was so eager to fulfill expectations, and I did all that. I didn't make any mistakes, and I did fill all the expectations. I did it all, but I did just that. I didn't leave a mark. And looking back, I realized I could have made so much more out of it, but I was too afraid to do it. And he said to me, you have to not make that same mistake. You have to go into your job and decide that you want to make a mark, and what is that mark going to be? And then you have to make sure that you actually force yourself to focus on it and really dare to go about it and do it. And I am not really, this is already 3 years ago, and I'm not really sure if I'm making a mark, but I try to remind myself of that. And a little test is to, for yourself, say, what are the 3 most important things you want to achieve? And then you can try to ask yourself, how do I spend my time and energy? And you'll probably find that that's not a match. You spend your time and energy doing other things. Try to force yourself to not lose sight of what really matters. I think that's very important. And of course, also to nudge, like Steve Jobs said, to shape rather than fill. It also means you have to go out of your comfort zone. It's not comfortable to be a shaper. It's much more comfortable to be a filler. But it's much more fulfilling to be a shaper. I talked about confidence, open-mindedness, and courage. Confidence is really very important. I believe you cannot be a good leader if you're not confident. And confident is not the same as cocky, okay? Confidence means you're calm, and that you have, let's say, the strength to give strength and confidence to others. I think a lot of mismanagement comes from people who are not confident, not because they're mean or bad, they're just not confident enough to be leaders. And you can't teach anyone to be confident. You have to sort of find your own confidence, but by being a good leader, or for you guys, by being surrounded by good people, good mentors, good teachers, you can gain confidence quicker than you otherwise would. I believe, it's possible to speed it up somehow. I spent several years gaining confidence. It took me a long time to dare to stand up and question a superior's opinion, for example. But just because someone is a professor or because they're your boss, it doesn't mean they know any better. They can be just as wrong. There is something called HIPPO. It means highest paid person's opinion. HIPPO is not really a good rule to run things. Doesn't mean you're right just because you're the boss. It's very often the contrary. And what happens often is, I used to work for Telenor, which is a huge corporation, 30,000 employees. I think I myself had some 11,000, 12,000 employees that I was responsible for. And you sit there and you make decisions. You have a lot of, let's say, this works better in Norwegian, oversikt og innsikt. But you have the oversight. But you can't possibly have, it's called overview in English, but you can't possibly have the insight, right? It's just not doable. So you end up sitting there in the overview and you make decisions without the proper insight. And the ones who have the insight, they do not really reach up to the overview, right? And so I think good management also has a lot to do with trying to combine the insight and the oversight or the overview. That is a very important thing to do, and you have to seek it out. You can't sit there managing big things and just assume that things will flow to you, because they don't. You have to actively be sure that you get the necessary insight as much as possible. Openness. I think also good leaders have the confidence and courage, maybe, to be open, to explain why, not just what. If people understand why change is taking place or change is necessary, and if you allow them to be part of the understanding of that change, people accept a lot more. People hate surprises. And if you can make them understand why, and if you can also be honest about the doubts you have, if you can be honest about the mistake you sometimes make, if you can sometimes say that, you know, I'm sorry, I was wrong about that, I really think that's a great strength. That's not weakness, that's strength. And I think people will have more faith in you if they see that you are honest enough and open enough to do that. I heard a great story from the police director, you know, that they have been criticized a lot in Norway, the police. They told me a story of they wanted to join in Follo district out here. They had 11 different lensmen, I don't know how you say that in, but, you know, police bosses, whatever, in a very small municipality area. And they wanted to join this together because the truth was just to keep all these offices open. They spent almost all their resources doing that, so there were actually very little police rotating out in the streets. And nobody knew that, but so they felt safe, but really it wasn't very good. And so the police wanted to consolidate, and they said, well, really it should only be 2, but that's maybe too much, so let's say we'll suggest 3. And of course there was massive criticism from all the mayors and all the different interest groups. And then what they did was that they dared to be open, and they invited them in, they explained the whole situation, they showed them how much time was spent in the office, how little time was spent out doing actual police work, etc. And after they were done with that, the mayors themselves insisted there should only be 2. They allowed them in on the why, and change was possible in a positive way, actually. And then one more thing, leading is achieving through others. It has very little to do with what you do yourself. It has all to do with what you make others people achieve and do. And so when you become leaders one day, maybe some of you already are in organizations or something, leading means giving up control. Because you have to give control to others in order for them to achieve. And that can be very uncomfortable. To trust that others will do the job and you will not do it your way. They will do it their way, and you have to trust the result that they will produce. And that has to do with confidence. You have to be confident in order to let go of control. But I think some who smash a bit in their first jobs as managers, that's what they don't manage very well. Very important thing to remember. And I'm going to say 2 more things. Am I okay with time for 2 more things? Okay. Courage, again. One thing I see that is often mismanaged is what I call, in Norwegian I call it unnlatelsessynd. I guess in English it would be the sin of omission. And that is in every organization, in every family for that matter, every relationship, every workplace, every society. There are things that are not optimal, things who do not work properly, problems, issues. And it's always so much easier to leave it than to deal with it, right? And how often don't we do that? I mean, we just leave it there and think, oh yeah, well, it will probably pass or something. Issues like that, they never pause, they just grow bigger. So as a leader, you have to actually go in and deal with issues, deal with problems, and not omit it. And I think by dealing with issues, you're actually doing everyone involved in the issue a favor, because the people who are the issue, they always know the best that they are the issue. And I have had so many experience up through the years that if you just pinpoint something, you talk about it, you suggest a change, you create awareness about something that could have been done in a different way to solve a problem, you do people a great favor, and often it's followed by good relief, actually, and it doesn't have to be so dramatic. So don't be afraid of tackling the issues, and just do it straight away. Don't omit them. And the final thing I wanted to say is that truly successful leaders are really good at one thing, and I'll get to it. And some of you, if you ever heard me talk before, you probably heard me say this before. Because I have this formula of success that I have used ever since I worked in SOL, actually 20 years ago. And it's called 5-15-80. And it goes like this, that I believe only 5% of success comes from having a good plan and a good strategy. I'm sure most of you think that's way more important than 5%. Most people tend to think if you have a good plan, you sort of done the job. But the reason I put it so low, I mean, you need to have a strategy. You need to know what you want to do. You have to have it, but it can be changed, it can be copied, it can be stolen, altered, everything. So it's a small part of it. 15% is position. It's easier to achieve success if you have great capabilities in the terms of knowledge or money or connections or a known brand if you're a business or whatever it is. Position somehow. But positions, they can really easily be lost, for one. And also you can get into the Kodak trap. If you have a strong position, you can become defensive. You have more to defend than opportunities to attack. So that's why I put it as low as 15. And the 80% of success, in my view, has to do with execution. Your ability to actually execute what you have set out to do. And that's the difference between those who succeed and those who don't succeed, is the way they execute. And in organizations, if you have a good executing organization, that organization is known by every single member of that organization being shapers and not fillers. You know, they take responsibility for what they do, and they see how they can improve it and do it better, and they are empowered to do so. And the sum of all those improvements is always greater than anything you can suggest from or instill from the top. And those type of organizations, they cannot be copied. It cannot be easily broken down. And they're actually very self-strengthening and resilient to any outside attack. So also, please remember that. It's all really about execution. That's what the job is about. That's what leading change is all about. So good luck to all of you, and thank you.